Click like and subscribe to keep up with new content. Okay, so this review is going to be just some of the things in Test 2, not all of them. There's already a couple of videos I've made that are in Schoology on some things like the 1802 letter from Thomas Jefferson and some other things, the structure of the Constitution. There's a separate video for that. I'm just going to hit a few key things, especially things that some students have had some issues with. So first, let me First, the Magna Carta. One of the questions in the study guide is, what are three principles in the Magna Carta that are important in America? The three principles you need to know are due process, rule of law, and representative government. Due process, we've talked about. Due process, think of the word due, D-U-E. Like if a paper is due, an assignment is due, it means it's time to turn in, it's owed. If a bill is due, it means you owe money. Due means something that's owed. Process, the steps to do something. Due process, just the steps that you're owed before the government can take away some right you have, whether it's property or your freedom or anything like that. If the government thinks you committed a crime, there's a process they have to go through to put you in jail. They have to arrest you, they have to charge you with a crime, they have to give you a trial. If the government wants to take away your property, to use it to build a highway or something like that, there's a process they go through. Okay, so that's due process. Everybody's entitled to a certain process outlined in law for whatever the crime or the issue is. Rule of law. Everybody is subject to the law, even the king. So with the Magna Carta, everybody is subject to the law, even the king. In the United States government, then everybody is subject to the law, even the president, even Congress has to follow the law. Finally, representative government. Okay? A lot of things you read about the Magna Carta, if you go online, they'll emphasize due process and rule of law, but they might not emphasize representative government as much. But for the state test at the end of the year, it is one of the things that you should know. The Magna Carta included representative government. What the Magna Carta did is allowed the nobles, who forced the king to sign this document, to select 25 of themselves, 25 nobles, who would then in the future serve as their representatives to the king. So it established the idea of representative government. So very important, know that the Magna Carta included the concept of representative government, which also became part of America, along with due process and rule of law. The Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower, the ship with the Pilgrims coming from Europe to the United States. When the Mayflower reached Plymouth Rock, it was not supposed to go there, it was going somewhere else, but it got off course and landed in the wrong place. Where it landed, there was no government, there was no city. The people then had to decide what to do. Some of them wanted to keep going and try to get to the right place. Some of them said, we need to stay here. They reached an agreement that they were going to stay, and then they had to decide what to do, so they reached an agreement on what kind of government, what rules they would have, and they wrote them down in a compact or a contract, the Mayflower Compact. So this goes with the idea of consent of the governed, because these people were starting from a blank slate. They were in a land where there was no city, no government. They could do whatever they wanted to do. They could have decided, let's just have anarchy. Let's just all go do our own thing and whatever. They could have made anything, but they made the Mayflower Compact. They formed a government from their agreement. So they consented, they agreed to this new government, and the government came from them. Remember, an important concept with consent of the governed is that the people exist first, and then the people form the government, which then comes up with like the Declaration of Independence, natural rights, the idea that if the people form the government, if they don't like the government, they can change the government. So Mayflower Compact, consent of the governed. English Bill of Rights. You don't need to know the year. I'm not going to ask you the year some of these things happen. But what's important about this year is that it's well before the U.S. Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, because the English Bill of Rights ends up forming a basis for the later Declaration of Independence. It included things like freedom of speech, the right to petition or ask the government to change things, the right to bear arms, to own weapons, the right to a trial by jury, the right to not have soldiers forced into your home and you have to house them and feed them. Now, you might notice these are all rights that end up in our U.S. Bill of Rights. They were also things the U.S. complained about in the Declaration of Independence, because the English Bill of Rights gave English people these rights, or recognized these rights among the English people. Well, the colonists considered themselves English, because these were British colonies. But the American colonists didn't get these rights. So one of their complaints leading to the Declaration of Independence is, hey, the English Bill of Rights says that English people have all these rights. We're English people, but you don't give us these rights, so we're upset. So this English Bill of Rights ends up leading to the Declaration of Independence because the Americans wanted to have a government that would secure and protect and honor those rights, which eventually ended up as part of the U.S. Bill of Rights. The Virginia Declaration of Rights. June 1776, again, I'm not going to ask you about the date, but the point there is it comes just before the Declaration of Independence. It also outlines those English Bill of Rights ideas that the Americans wanted. The Americans are saying, we have these rights too, we have natural rights. They're putting it into their documents, and then eventually those same ideas end up part of the U.S. Bill of Rights. Because again, part of the whole reason for the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution, is the Americans wanted a government that would secure those rights, would protect those rights, honor those rights. Constitution of Massachusetts. It's important because it created a system of government for the state of Massachusetts that had 3 separate branches of government. Might sound familiar. Montesquieu's idea being incorporated there, and those ideas also then become part of the U.S. Constitution later. Most other states at the time gave more power to what's called the lower house, okay, rather than the upper house, which would be the Senate. But this one is going to give equal power to all 3 branches. It has a strong governor who has veto power. Okay, that's a lot like the U.S. presidency. So this idea becomes part of the U.S. presidency in the Constitution. But this is very different than the Articles of Confederation. How much power did the president have under the Articles of Confederation? Anyone remember? There was no president. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no president. So, very different. This idea of a strong leader, strong executive, becomes part of the U.S. Constitution now. And of course, independent courts. In our system and the Constitution, independent courts, it means that the courts do not depend on the legislature or the governor / president for their jobs. In our constitutional system, the president nominates people for the federal courts, the Senate confirms them, and once they're appointed, they have those jobs for life unless they get impeached. But once they have the jobs, the idea is they're independent. They don't depend on keeping the governor or the president happy or keeping the legislature happy. They're independent. One important difference, though, these are all similarities to the U.S. Constitution, becomes the basis. One important difference, though, was that voting in Massachusetts was based on your wealth. The more wealth you had, the more things you could vote for. This is similar to the English system. In their parliament, they have a House of Lords, which represents the wealthy nobles, and they have a House of Commons that represents the average people. That system was claimed at the time to more fairly represent both groups, because you want to represent the rich people and the not rich people. But in our system, we have a system where we vote for everything. Except originally in the Constitution, we didn't vote for Senate directly. The states appointed them. But that's more about federalism. So, but this is a big difference. Just know that it wasn't exactly copied. These things became part of the U.S. Constitution, but this part was not exactly copied. Constitutional compromises, remember, there's the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise or Connecticut Plan. The Connecticut Plan brought together the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. So you had the small states, New Jersey Plan, wanting every state to be equally represented. An important concept in understanding a lot of the U.S. Constitution is remembering that these 13 independent countries effectively were coming together, and they wanted to make sure that their states still mattered. So New Jersey wanted to make sure small states still mattered. So they had the New Jersey Plan. Virginia wanted to make sure states that were bigger and had more people had influence. So they compromised on the House of Representatives for population in the Senate for states. 3/5 compromise. Okay, that was an argument between the North and the South. The North said the South didn't consider slaves to be people, so therefore they shouldn't count for population. The South said, but they are people, at least in this one case, so they should count for our population. And the compromise was the 3/5 compromise. For every 5 slaves, 3 would count toward population. And finally, the Electoral College. The Electoral College, though, I'm going to talk more about in just a moment. After impeachment. Impeachment. Impeachment starts in the House of Representatives. Impeachment means to be formally charged by the House. So when we say that a president was impeached, we do not mean the president was kicked out of office. Okay? We mean that the House of Representatives voted to charge the president or whoever it is with some sort of crime, high crimes and misdemeanors is the constitutional language. So if somebody accuses the president or a federal judge or the vice president of some crime, the House votes on whether to charge the person. If the vote passes and the House charges the person with a crime, that is impeachment. Then it goes to the Senate for trial. Okay? The Senate has to have a 2/3 majority in order to convict. There have been multiple presidents impeached before. None of them have been convicted. Okay? This is a high threshold, having to get 2/3 majority. The idea of why we don't want just a simple majority, 51%, is we don't want if the president is a Democrat and most of the members of the House or Senate and Senate are Republicans, we don't want the Republicans to be able to get up together and just vote out any Democrat president they don't like, or vice versa. If it's mostly Democrats in Congress and a Republican president, you don't want the party in Congress to vote out the party in president. So you want a system where in order to kick a president out of office, at least a substantial member of that person's own party thinks, yes, they have done something so bad that they need to be kicked out. It's never happened so far. It almost happened with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had committed some crimes and was about to be impeached by the House of Representatives, and almost certainly would have been convicted by the Senate, but he ended up resigning because he knew what was going to happen. So he left office. But remember, impeachment just means accused and charged by the House. Then it goes to the Senate for trial. Back to the Electoral College. The Electoral College is controversial. It was controversial back then. It's one of the compromises. But what are the reasons for the Electoral College? Some of the reasons given for the Electoral College. One, it unites the country by requiring broad support. So for example, most Americans live on the East Coast or West Coast. So if all you need is to get the vote of most Americans, you could have a campaign that appeals to just people on the coast and ignores everybody else, and you might actually get most of the votes. By requiring the Electoral College where you need states and a large number of states, people have to appeal to a broader range of America. One of the big issues and concerns in the framers of the Constitution was how do we keep this big, diverse nation united? So we wanted to make sure that people had to appeal to a broad section of the country. It also was argued to protect minority interests. Okay? If you're just appealing to 51% of the population, there's a bunch of small groups that you can ignore. But the Electoral College potentially helps protect some of those groups. A good example would be Cuban Americans in Miami. As a percentage of all Americans, Cuban Americans in Miami are a relatively small percent. But if you're looking at just Florida, obviously that's a much larger percent of Florida. So in the Electoral College, you're not trying to just get 51% of Americans, but you're trying to get 51% of the votes in Florida. So now the Cuban American vote in Miami has more influence. So it protects the minority interest by giving different minority groups around the country a larger say in the presidency. People have to pay attention. So as a result, Cuban Americans have substantial influence on national politics for things like trade policies and stuff with Cuba. Because if you want to win Florida, you can't afford to just write off the Cuban American vote. it pushes a two-party system which unites the country. There are a lot of countries that have parliamentary systems where they don't elect the prime minister. The prime minister is chosen by the parliament. And in those systems, if you have a small interest group, a small party that gets 5% of the vote, you might get 5% of the seats in parliament. That's designed to make sure every little group gets a say. Our system was designed to take all these different groups and push them to unite, to compromise together. So we have a winner-take-all system. If you get most of the electoral votes, you become president. If you don't get most of the votes, you get nothing. So there's no incentive to go for a group that's important and significant, but not a majority. So what you want to do is take all these different groups and form a majority. You want to get people united together so that you can have a majority. And that pushes to a two-party system where we just have two parties. They're both representing roughly half of America, and they're both constantly trying to get a little bit more so they can represent a majority of America and therefore win elections. And also, this is going to maintain the federal system of government because, again, states wanted to make sure states stayed important. They didn't want presidential candidates to appeal only to different groups of people, but not to states. So every time there's a presidential election, Florida matters, Ohio matters. So states are still important in the system. And there was also an idea with the elections. Some of the framers wanted the president to be chosen sort of like the Senate, where states would choose the presidents. Some of the framers wanted the president to be chosen like the House of Representatives, where people would vote on it. So it was a compromise where people are voting in the states, but the states are still an important issue. So we still have that federal system where states matter. So some important issues and reasons for the Electoral College. So as I was saying before lunch, the Electoral College is still really controversial today. People will complain about it. It was controversial back then. That's why it's a compromise, because some people wanted something different. But the complaint today is that it's undemocratic, because in a democracy, the majority of people should win. Well, yes, it is undemocratic. That was the point of the Electoral College. Not to make a democracy, a pure democracy where 51% always wins, but to make a union of states and to make a system where minority groups would still have representation, to make a system where you couldn't appeal just to the largest group or the majority, but you had to appeal to a broad section of groups. So that was the whole idea. Yes, it is undemocratic. That was the point. And the same complaint is made of the Senate, because the Senate is undemocratic in the sense that 51 senators don't necessarily represent the majority of Americans, because they represent the majority of states, and there's lots of small states. But that was also the point of the Senate. There were people, framers, who wanted a system, the Virginia plan, where the population got the representation, and those places with the most people would win. Well, they came up with a compromise where the House of Representatives gets the population, the Senate gets the states, and in order for a bill to become a law, it has to pass through both. So it has to be popular with the people in the House and the states in the Senate. So yes, it is undemocratic, but that was the point of it. So now, that's it for that quick little review. Again, there's some other videos in Schoology. Make sure you know those things. But now, use your time wisely, review your notes, and then when you're ready, take the test.